So for the first session, we thought we'd just cover some tree selection and planting. And that's what we'll do this morning with these nice little samples that you got. And I love them because they're not perfect. And that's what we like. That's how we learn, from imperfection. So let's just follow this briefly, and then we'll get out into the orchard there and do what we're here to do.
We're doers.
We're doers. I like that. Yeah. Okay, so I think most of this really makes sense. And I always say, I've been teaching at UCR some classes, and this is a really great example of science and biology and practicality and dealing with nature. And the more we deal with nature, the better off we are, rather than against nature, which is still happening in so many cases. We're trying to improve nature. We can't improve nature. It's so perfect. So that comment, young trees grow twice as fast when they're planted correctly and will live twice as long. And I like your example of how many have seen trees that just completely fall over in a windstorm. But that's been happening since the day it was planted. It didn't just happen. It didn't just lose rigidity. So selecting trees. So this is where we'll look at the two samples we've got, and I like the samples that you've chosen because of their imperfection. We can look at them when we go over there. So what we're going to think about when we're selecting trees, what are we selecting them for? What's the purpose of that tree, or what's the purpose of any tree? And you know, they have a lot of purposes, which you all know: shade, privacy, aesthetics, windbreak, etc., etc. The list is long, and you've all entertained all of those reasons. And the limitations of the site. Sometimes we forget to, we so much want that little citrus tree right there, and it's right between my house and my neighbor's house, and there's 8 feet on my side and 8 feet on his side, and we just want that little citrus to fit into that space. And what happens? It grows beautifully, and then after a couple of years, what do you end up doing? You end up pruning it back because it's in the way of the wall, it's getting tall, it's overhanging the roof. We don't want citrus rats in our roof tiles. And then you over trim it, which we do all the time on everything. And that's probably one of my most contagious complaints, is over trimming, over watering, and over fertilizing. Probably 90% of all the calls I get to look at a pathogen or mallee of any sort is secondary to those 3 things. So suffice it to say, we don't have a lot of pathogens here in the valley, but we cause a lot simply by those 3 things: topping trees, poor trimming, over trimming, fertilizing. If it's not doing well, just throw some fertilizer. Remembering, fertilizing is the last resort most of the time. And sometimes we have to do it because there's really a nutrient deprivation, but most of the time the nutrients are right here behind us, and what you guys are doing is supplying all of those things that chemical fertilizer is trying to do. And I say trying because a lot of it is very ineffective. It's doing more harm than good. Because you think in this valley, we don't have fertile soils naturally, because all our soils are made up of the alluvial fans broken down on the mountains all around us. So then we end up with natural DG. We end up with soils that don't have a lot of biologicals in them, and we end up with sterile soils, so to speak. And our water, where does our water come from? It does, it's there, but we would like to naturally, in a natural desert, a lush desert, it comes from rainfall. And we really, for practical purposes, we get practically no rainfall, because we get, the statistics are 2 to 4 inches. Well, that's in 2 good downfalls, and most of that washes from here down to the Salton Sea, those big floods that we get when we get them. So And that's a whole nother subject. You see, I'm hesitating because I think, okay, we could just talk and talk just about that. And who's talking about, oh, Lauren, weren't you talking about water, some of the water information that you've been getting? It's endless, just endless. But we are really dependent on our plant life on our irrigation water. And all 5 irrigation sources right down the Coachella Valley are all very sodic sources. It doesn't matter if it's the Colorado River or wells or what the source is. The whole valley irrigation sources are very sodic, which means they have a lot of salt, mostly sodium and calcium. So every time you turn on that tap, you're depositing a salt layer, what we call a perched water table. So you turn that tap on and you're layering, depending on what the flow is and how fast or how slow you apply that, you're laying down a fine layer of salt. So in other words, a perched water table. The next layer, the next time you water, where's that water going? Just to that layer and running off. So we're creating still some very shallow watering, which we don't want. So we've got to think about how do we get deep watering, because that's what trees need. Trees need deep, infrequent watering. And most of the time, we're just turning the tap on, letting it run for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, maybe longer. So we're creating a shallow water pattern. And the way you get deep watering is to water, have your spigot, whatever it is, whether it's your hose end, a 1/4 inch drip emitter like you've got out here, and I think you also have some 1/2 inch bubblers out there. Doesn't matter what it is, it has to be turned down really low and let it run very, very slowly, because the slower it runs, you think of the osmotic pull of that water molecule, the slower it runs, the more deeply it's going to penetrate through the soil profile and get to where the roots are. Because most of our rhizosphere, which is where the fine feeder roots are, is 12 to 14 inches. So if we're watering 3 to 4 inches, we're not watering what we want to be watering. So infrequent, deep watering. Deep watering, we know how to get that very slow for a very long time until you've got saturation. Deep or infrequent means that you want that, all that water you just put on to be used up. I used to say dried out, and then I think, no, it's because you don't want the roots to dry out. You don't want them to be moist, but it used up is probably a better way to think about it. So in other words, it's going to be used up through the osmotic uptake by the plant or by the tree, taken up and used for every inch of that tree's physical properties, or drained through the soil profile. We're always after good drainage on everything, or evaporated through the natural ambient temperatures, which happens very quickly here. And you know, that's one of the reasons, it's a little bit of a side thing, but when we're watering at home during the summer, try to be very judicious and not watering too quickly when you see something withered up. You see your tree starts to get a withered leaf or starts to yellow, and the first thing you think of, oh, it's 110 degrees, 120 degrees, must not be getting enough water. And it looks pretty dry. And the first thing you do is turn that up, where that's just the opposite thing to what you should be doing. So just keep that in mind. In the summer, really watch that you don't overwater. That's when we cause disease, because we get that water sitting there, the warm ambient temperatures, the warm soil temperatures. And soil temperatures don't get as warm as you think. Most of the time, we take for a soil temperature at 4 inches below grade. And most of the time, that doesn't vary a lot. So the ambient temperature on the roots that we're watering doesn't vary that much. So we don't want to get into the idea or the feeling that in the summer we double our water, in the winter we cut it in half, because that's not necessarily true. It's just taking in all those factors, but those are the two things that are most easy to see when you're a gardener, when you're out in your yard. Oh, it's wilting, it's winter time, I must be watering it too little. Summertime, I must be not watering it enough. So it's a logical thing to happen. So we just need to kind of get out of that mindset. So the salt deposits then need to be broken up. So let me just go back to the use of fertilizer, because I think this is really important. because everybody puts on so much fertilizer. Remember, we talked about our water being very sodic, and fertilizer is a salt, it's a chemical salt. And how do we get it onto the plant or into the plant? We either take the granular and sprinkle it around, or we take a liquid and pour it around. And then to get it down to where we want it to be, we take the hose or the water element and try to get that into the soil and through the soil by water. So you're trying to dissolve a salt with a salt. Not very efficient, is it? And then the nutrients that does get to the feeder roots often aren't the ones that it's lacking because of the breakdown of the nutrient value and the uptake of the osmotic pull. So sometimes you're just wasting money, but sometimes you're really adding a lot of things we don't want into the soil and ultimately into the plants. So try to really, and this is all the nutrients, almost all of the nutrients that we need is right here, because it's that cycle recreating itself. It's the best form. Nitrogen is probably one of the most common nutrient deprivations that you see on anything. If you're looking at your house plants or your garden or your orchards, you see that and nitrogen comes from nitrogen-fixing bacteria in nature, which the most wonderful source is through leguminous plants and anything that has a pod, like a pea pod or a pepper tree, or and those things break down. And that nitrogen, if we just let those pods and everything fall and have it, which you're doing, by composting, you're reintroducing that to the natural system. So when you're doing that, and that kind of nitrogen-fixing bacteria is far more effective than chemical nitrogen that builds up. So I'm just kind of getting back to that reason why not to use those fertilizers, because you've got almost all the nutrients you need right here, because you're recycling what we're trying to feed. And so what we're lacking is what we're recreating here and going back. So I love you guys. What you're doing here is absolutely fantastic. And you're doing it from a really good, knowledgeable, scientific way. You're not just, throwing all the stuff into the pail and throwing. Because composting has been so misunderstood for so long, and not. So I'm really glad to see a group like you that are doing it so scientifically and so correctly and so naturally. Again, because the more we work with nature than against it, the more successful we'll be. So our limitations on the site: the soil is a great limitation, natural water, rainfall, because when you get rainfall, when we have high salts, we're building up a high pH, especially in the summertime. And when we get rain, what the rain does, it flushes all those salts out of the soil. And you can see it when we get a rainfall. You see all the white carcidia. Overhead wires being another one. Sometimes you think, well, I'm just going to plant this tree there, but I forget 10 feet over there on the fence line, we've got the overhead wires. And if you've ever been in an old home and your tree is up to that wires, you know what happens. They come in and they just top it. Yeah, if not, just lose it. So really consider the things that are going to be happening 5, 10, 15 years to that tree when you plant it. Don't think about today. Come back to that citrus tree in between your houses. If you want it to be good, productive citrus, like we're going to plant one today, make sure that it has lots of room, because citrus should grow with a heavy, deep canopy. And every citrus I see in this valley, when in a home or a private situation, the first thing that the trimmers do, for some reason, well, I know the reason, I know why they think that, but they'll go in and they'll open up the inside. And you never want to do that to a tree. So when you're selecting a tree, think of how that tree grows in nature. Does it grow with a heavy, deep canopy? Does it grow with a lacy, open canopy? And trim it and look after it to that end. So a citrus, if you go out to the citrus orchards in thermal, you see that the canopies are very, very heavy and very dense. And you know, here, when you see them opening that up, you'll ask, why are you doing that? And they'll say, so that the sunlight can come through and so that the wind can go through. You're not creating a wind barrier. Which you think about that nature, if it's creating that tree with a heavy, deep canopy, it's going to give it the stability to hold that. Fruit, especially seed fruit, should grow under the shade of the canopy. And the fruit trees you do see that are producing good fruit, where are they? They're out here. And they're getting sunburned, they're ripening too quickly, the fruit isn't as good a quality as we'd like to see because they need to ripen inside the canopy. And so think about the nature of that species of tree that you've chosen to plant. How does that grow in its natural habitat? Because like I said, everything we plant here is not indigenous to this area. Even though we're a desert, you think about the other deserts that are very productive, like go to Arizona or Nevada. Think about the Phoenix area, they'll get anywhere from 8 to 28 inches of rain a year to our 0. And they have lush desert plants. So be careful too. The other thing that we have at our advantage is the education that we are now, we can look up anything and we could get such good information, but we can also get information that maybe isn't as relevant as we think it is. We say, well, is this a good desert plant? And the World Wide Web says, yes, it's a very good desert plant, but it may not be applicable to our desert that doesn't get any natural, that doesn't have any bad biologicals in the soil and no natural natives. So that's one thing to really consider when you're looking things up, and I know we all do it, and I love the fact that we can do it, but the misinformation or the information that doesn't necessarily apply to us, think it through, get other opinions. Don't be afraid to get other opinions. You know, if I say something and you know another certified arborist might say, well, you know, I'm not sure that that's what I think. It's really always good to get second opinions, third opinions, and then you have something to compare. And it's good, I love it when somebody gets another opinion from somebody, because sometimes I get so used to saying or assuming something that I've forgotten, you know, I forgot about that. And he's saying, this is what I do, because then it brings us back to where we should be in our thinking. So don't be afraid to get other opinions, and then most of the time you can weigh those opinions. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? Or do I need to compare? Do I need to talk to this person again and say, why is this person differing from you and he's got the same training? You know, there's probably a pretty logical reason. And sometimes you just forget about the way you've said something or what you've said. So it's really always good. And if you're confident in what you're doing and you think you're knowledgeable, then you need to project the reason that you're confident, and that will make sense. Because it is a common sense thing. We're working with nature and with science, and science is nature, nature is science. It should make sense. So usually I'll say, if I've said something and it doesn't make sense to you, I'm probably not explaining it well. It's not that that isn't the case, it's just maybe I'm not getting that point across the way I should be. So does that make sense? So it should make sense. So anyway, just some of the other limitations are the confined root zone. We might think, well, we've got a lot of room to plant a tree right there, but if it's a big mesquite tree or a Ficus benjamina, what's going to happen to those roots? Because the Ficus benjamina or the mesquite, those roots want to be out here, and this is all concrete, that's a parking lot. So for the first 5 years, it's going to be a wonderful spot for it. But when it's really coming into its own, what's going to happen to it? You know, we're going to say, the people that own the building are going to say, well, we need to get that tree off of where it's going to be hitting the wall or any structure. We don't want it to lift the concrete, and we don't want that's the limitations. So try and limit your limitations. Don't plant a big tree when you've got a driveway and a walkway and a structure. So, and expect it to do really well in 10 years. So it seems like those are very practical things, but sometimes we just need to have something to, are we considering all these things? And there's a whole bunch more than what we just outlined here, but and most of the time you can just think it through. Soil types, of course, we can get more into that. And climate, of course, is it going to sustain the heavy, hot, humid summers? And you know, humidity is something new to us because we used to say this is a hot, dry climate. In the last 3 years, we've had so much humidity that it's really caused a lot of problems. We've seen a lot of pathogens coming our way that we've never seen in the valley before, especially in the ag industry. So climate is something to be considered, and probably more so in the future than we have up to this point. And then, so in that same vein, then choose species that are appropriate for your conditions. And each one will vary a lot, but do some research on that species. Today, we're going to plant a persimmon, which doesn't belong here. And so it's going to be really fun to see how we can cultivate that and see what success we have with it. And don't be afraid to try things. So I'm really glad that you chose that. I mean, I love persimmon. And the persimmon wood is so magnificent. I do a lot of woodwork and I just love to work with persimmon. It's almost like an ebony wood, but really nice. Before metal, they used to use all the golf clubs were made out of, the woods were made out of persimmon. Beautiful, beautiful wood. And then now we should move over there and examine the trees. And what we're going to be looking for is the quality, the structure, the health of it, and this is what we want you to be really cognizant of when you go to the nursery and pick a tree, or when you're going to develop a new species. So we're going to be looking at the roots. So bare root, if it's a bare root, you know, if you're planting just a little seedling, make sure that your roots are long and fibrous and moist and good proportion to the root stock if you're planting from seed. And then your B&B, or burlap and balled. Make sure that it's really firm, that your B&B is really firm, especially around the roots. So you don't want to pick that up and just have everything almost ready to just leave the burlap. So potted ones, like we have this morning, we want to make sure we have no girdled roots. So when you're in the nursery, don't be afraid to pull that soil up from around the edge of the pot or the box or whatever's holding it in there, and make sure that the roots it hasn't been in that pot too long. They're starting to girdle. So those are very hard to correct. And anything that's been pruned, especially the bigger ones in the bigger boxes and the big BOB, where you're pruning big roots, like we've been bringing in some of these giant olive trees from the Visalia area, 100-year-old olive trees, and so they're cutting these roots, big roots like that. It's not something I advocate. I just help them to try to save them or get them planted properly as good as we can. It's just, but even the smallest ones, make sure if they have done any root pruning or root cutting to get it to where it's manageable so you can transfer it into the new location. Make sure that those cuts are nice and clean, that they're not jagged or ripped, because that'll make a big, big difference when you're trying to establish that root, that new root, because it has to heal itself first, and most of the time it doesn't. It goes off of runners. So make sure that the cuts are clean and that they're no wider than your finger, like on plants like that. Don't get them with roots that have been cut that are this large. So that's kind of a rule of thumb. That's the rule of thumb, use your thumb. So looking at the crown of the tree, we're going to look and make sure, is that crown quite symmetrical? So in other words, it's balanced, the scaffolding and the crown is very balanced.